This session was recorded on April 1st, 2022. Our group works together for Scholars at Risk under the Scholars in Prison project, advocating for the release of Dr. Ahmadreza Djalali. To start, I would like to acknowledge that our group is located at UBC in Vancouver, and we're gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. It's important to acknowledge that this acknowledgement is more than just the words, but a commitment to knowledge and research of the traditional lands on which we live. Today, we will be talking to Dr. Amiry-Moghaddam and about the state of arbitrary detentions in Iran with relation to Dr. Djalali's case.
I'm sorry. My name is Mahmoud Amiry-Moghaddam. I'm a professor at the University of Oslo and director of the human rights organization Iran Human Rights. I'm based in Oslo, Norway, but our organization has members and supporters all over the world, and we have a supporting network also inside Iran. So we work on monitoring and documentation and reporting about the human rights violations, in particular the death penalty. So I am thinking to talk a little bit about the Ahmadreza Djalali, but before that, I would like to talk about the current situation of the human rights in Iran and put Dr. Djalali's situation in a context. As you know, Iran is one of the few countries in the world where, due to its grave human rights situation, United Nations Human Rights Council has appointed a special rapporteur for this country. So at the present moment, there are, I think, 4 or 5 countries in the world with a special rapporteur. And it means that twice a year, a report will be presented to the UN or Human Rights Council on the situation. And that gives the opportunity to put the human rights situation on the agenda of the international community. Because unfortunately, human rights is not highly prioritized in international politics. Issues such as, of course, security, finances very often come before human rights. And again, unfortunately, our experience is that human rights is something that many countries talk about, but when it comes to binding actions, normally they are not based on the human rights. And I think that we, like civil society individuals, we can change it, because I think that sustainable peace and stability doesn't come without the human rights. If we look around the world, normally it's not the democratic countries which have support of their own people that normally become aggressors. And I think it's important to keep in mind that I believe international politics should be based on long-term strategy, and any long-term strategy must have human rights of every country's people in its mind. So when it comes to Iran, you know that the Islamic Republic has existed in 43 years now. Actually, officially, the Islamic Republic was established today in 1979, 1st of April. And it was based on the referendum that didn't meet any international standards, where people were supposed to say yes or no to the Islamic Republic, and that was the only choice. And that's how it started. Now, 40 years later, we see Iran as a country where its people's rights are violated every single day. Actually, today also, 1st of April 2022, there was a vote in the Human Rights Council where they extended the special rapporteur's mandate for 1 more year. And Canadian government, of course, has always supported this mandate, and that's very good, and we are grateful for that. But back to Iran. Talking about the human rights violations, we have some indicators on grave human rights violations, and they include the death penalty. As you know, Iran is, after China, the country with the highest number of executions. In average, about 1 person is executed every single day. And if you go to our website, iranhr.net, we have an execution counter on top of it. And so far this year, 109 people have been executed. And this is despite the fact that there have been some holidays where normally executions don't take place, probably because the executioners also need holiday. But right after the first day after holiday, 4 people were executed. So it has been the New Year's holiday in Iran. When it comes to the death penalty, so one issue is, of course, people who are executed, majority of them are charged with common crimes like homicide, drug trafficking, and then these are the 2 large groups. And then there are some for rape, and there is a 4th group which is called, they use vague terms such as, it's in Arabic, it's called muharebe. It means waging war against God. And then there is something else called corruption on earth, meaning that you do something which is punishable to such a large extent that it should be punished by death. And it's the judge who decides what the large extent is. So Dr. Djalali is charged with waging war against God and corruption on earth. So these are the charges that the authorities announce, but we can't trust these charges because we don't have fair trials and due process in Iran. It means that people who are arrested, actually anyone who is arrested, suspect for having broken the law, or if they want, they can make the person confess to the charges they want to. So confessions or forced confessions, they are the most common way of proving guilt in the Islamic Republic. And this is not only about, the political cases or, cases like Dr. Djalali. Even people who are arrested, suspected of a criminal charge, such as murder or drug trafficking, they are during the interrogation phase, beaten so much or tortured in other ways. It can also be psychological torture until they confess. So we have many examples, also examples in the official Iranian media. Some years ago, there was a title of, in one of the newspapers in Iran. The title said, "Proved innocent 48 hours before execution." And that's, a very exciting title. And it was written that a middle-aged man was supposed to be executed on that day, but 48 hours prior to execution, they found the person who actually was guilty. He was charged with murder. So when the journalist asked the man who was supposed to be executed and now proved to be innocent, asked him, "But your sentence is based on confession. Why did you confess to a murder that you didn't commit?" And he said, "They beat me so much that I thought if I don't confess, I will die here." And this is not a unique case. So that's just one of the cases. And interestingly, even though it was written in the newspaper and publicly known to all people, nobody went back to see who was beating you, who gave the order, and why couldn't you defend yourself? Where was the lawyer? He's supposed to have a lawyer, and none of them were there. And no accountability. Nobody took the responsibility of this, and they just wrote it as if it was an exciting story for their newspaper. So this lack of due process, fair trials, use of torture to get confessions, it's very, I would say it's systematic. So therefore, ordinary people in Iran, they, whenever they hear somebody has committed something and is punished, in general, people don't believe it. Even if the person is guilty, they don't have trust in the system because of how it has been during the last 40 years. Another way, in cases, in high-profile cases, they very often use televised confessions. So before a court or a trial, they show televised confessions of the person. Like sometimes the person says that he has committed this or that crime, and sometimes they manipulate the video, as they did with Dr. Djalali. So Dr. Djalali, they showed a video on a film clip on Iranian TV, and basically, if you listen to his words, because sometimes he was saying something, and sometimes they were voiceover, like the narrator was talking. So his words, none of them say that he has been doing anything wrong, actually. But the narrator was making, a narrative out of what he was saying, that just to make the case. And Dr. Djalali has also said that later, that what they showed on TV, it has nothing to do with what I say, and they had just cut parts of it and put them together and with the narrative. But as I said, happily people don't trust it. So, and you probably know what Dr. Djalali has gone through, long periods of solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is kind of torture that is also widely used. The way it happens is that they put the prisoner in a small room, sometimes very small, so that it's basically the space just for one person, with the lights on all the time, 24 hours, for a long time, sometimes for several weeks. And you don't see or hear anyone else than your interrogator. And then you have sleep deprivation. And Dr. Djalali has, you probably have seen the pictures, he has lost a lot of weight while he has been in prison. So, I mean, these are just parts of the human rights violations. Beside that, human rights violations happen throughout the country every single day. It's all from rights of minorities, which are violated both according to the law and in practice. So religious minorities, of course, sexual minorities, they are not acknowledged that they actually exist, but there are paragraphs in the law about homosexual acts between men and between women, and it's very detailed. So for men, it's death penalty, and they describe the active part, the passive part, and for women is 100 lashes. If repeated 3 times, then it will be death penalty, and these are like parts of law. And so we are not going to go through this, and I'm not going to talk about of course the freedom of expression, that every year thousands of people are arrested simply for arrested or persecuted, or sometimes even sentenced only for practicing peacefully their rights. So the right of expressing their opinion, which is also according to the Iranian law, you are free to express your opinion peacefully, but it's not trusted. Even trade unionists who don't talk about politics, but about this, the working situation, they can be persecuted or arrested for not talking about, of course, those who are critical to the system. So back to Dr. Djalali. So since 2016, of course, he has been in the situation where he is, and he has been sentenced to death after, a grossly unfair trial, and based on charges that, regardless of what charges are, as long as he hasn't had a fair trial and access to a lawyer of his choice and hasn't been able to defend himself, he's regarded as innocent. But why do Iranian authorities insist in keeping Dr. Djalali? So you have probably heard, not a long time ago, about Nazanin Ratcliffe Zaghari, who an Iranian-British dual citizen, who also was arrested in one of her trips to Iran. And eventually he was released. We are very glad for that, after the United Kingdom paid about, is it 400 million pounds, money that Iranian authorities wanted because the previous government of Shah, like 44 years ago, had paid to receive some tanks and They didn't receive the tanks, and then there was this revolution and regime change, and now they want the money. And because of the sanctions, the money wasn't given to the Iranian authorities. So once they got the money, they released Nazanin. So it not only seems as that Iranian authorities have been using Nazanin as a bargaining chip, like a hostage, and the money paid by the British government looks like ransom. It's actually what it is. Although they don't want to call it ransom, and Iranian authorities don't want to call Nazanin, didn't want to call Nazanin a hostage. The same is with Dr. Djalali, a dual citizen who, dual citizens are very valuable for the Iranian authorities because it's not the first time. Throughout the years, Western governments, they have paid in different ways to Iranian authorities to release hostages. 40 years ago, the method looked like hostage taking. It was much more straightforward. So, for example, Iranian or Iran supporting militants in Lebanon or different parts of the world, they would take someone as hostage, and then the government of that country, it has happened with the US, with France several times, would negotiate with the Iranian authorities, and then they would come to an agreement, and the hostage would be released. That it has happened several times. So sometimes hostages are released after getting money, sometimes after releasing Iranian nationals in Western prisons who have been sentenced for acts of terrorism. So a very famous case is about someone called Naqash, who was arrested in France because he wanted to commit a terrorist attack on a former Iranian prime minister in France, but he was arrested. He didn't manage to kill the prime minister, and he was arrested. A few years later, the Iranian foreign minister said in an interview that we have been talking to the French government. If they release Mr. Naqash, then we can make sure that their hostages in Lebanon are released. So that was the old-fashioned hostage taking. Nowadays, it doesn't happen that way. Now, they so-called arrest someone, they charge him or her, if they are good, they can get televised confessions and then use it as a bargaining chip. And we strongly believe that what they are doing with Dr. Djalali. And unfortunately, it's a very difficult situation because on one hand, we really want Dr. Djalali to be free and come back to his family. And on the other hand, we think that there must be another way. There must be, as long as the Western countries, they continue paying ransom to Iranian authorities, they will continue taking hostages. So I think that's a dilemma that Western governments need to solve. This hostage diplomacy cannot continue. We all remember, when ISIS took hostages. They did it very straightforward. They took someone, they said, this is the money we want, and so that they could release. Iranian authorities, they do exactly the same. Instead of standing in front of the video with a knife and threatening to kill the person if they don't receive the money, they do it behind the scenes. They threat with the death penalty, but they say that this person has been committing espionage, has been a spy for Israel, and they say that they make up a story. They say that there has been an independent court, so we don't have any power on that court. But on the other hand, behind the scene, they make their counterpart countries understand what they actually want. So we think that at the present moment, there are some Iranians who are either in the European prisons. There are like 4 Iranians sentenced in a Belgian prison, in a Belgian court for acts of terrorism. They wanted to do a terrorist attack with a bomb at an opposition rally near Paris. So they are candidates. And then there is another Iranian who is arrested by Swedish police for participation in mass executions in 1988. So he's charged with crimes against humanity and at the present moment being tried. So his court has lasted several months now. It is going on every day. And we believe that's what the Iranian authorities want. So what can we do? I think the civil society, ordinary people like us, we can actually make the political costs of keeping Dr. Djalali higher for the Iranian authorities. If the political costs are too high, I think they will be forced to release him. And we have examples of, for example, inside Iran, people who have been sentenced to death, that the international pressure that starts from people, and when people in democratic countries they raise their voice, fortunately they are heard by their governments, and then that issue is put on the agenda of Western governments' dialogue with Iran. So right now, Iranian authorities are negotiating with the Western countries on the nuclear deal. And what we have said repeatedly to any government negotiating with the Iranian authorities is that any negotiation with Iran must put the human rights on top of its agenda. Human rights demands. We don't want any more Western politicians say we regret or we are sorry or even we condemn, but we want them actually to make demands. We know that the Iranian authorities in the present situation, the way they are, they have to follow the demands. I can give you an example. For some years, or for many years, in Iran, we had the stoning sentence. Have you heard of that? Stoning? Like as a punishment, it's a brutal punishment, death penalty by throwing stones. And that was practiced for people who were charged with adultery. like married man or woman who had an affair with another person. And in 1998, the European Parliament passed, I think it was a proposal that if that in order for Europe to upgrade its economic relations with Iran, Iran has to stop stoning. So that was put as a condition. And a couple of years later, or in 2002, in December, Iranian foreign minister signed a moratorium that we will not, that all stoning sentences will be stopped. That was one step, but everybody knows that, who is familiar with Iran, knows that the foreign minister doesn't have the power to do so. So Iranian authorities continued stoning, but they just didn't announce it until in 2009, when case of a woman whose name is Sakina Ashtiani became so well known in the world, and that's because of campaigns by ordinary people, by human rights organizations, by civil society. The case was so big that all the politicians across the world, they were almost forced to say something about that. And at that stage, Iran had to stop stoning. So since 2010, we haven't had any stoning in Iran. Not that they have changed their minds or they don't believe in it anymore, because it's still in the law, but they can't do it because the political cost is very high. And I think a sustainable way to get Dr. Djalali released and to avoid more hostage taking by the Iranian authorities is to raise the political cost. There should be demands. It's not the Iranian authorities who put demand, who is supposed to put demands towards West, saying that if you don't do this, I will kill this person. It should be the other way around. Iran is a full member of United Nations. They are involved. They have diplomatic relations with many countries, and I think this is something that should be used. So that was a very short, but maybe introduction. So I would be glad to answer to your questions, or maybe we can discuss together.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us that invaluable insights into your perspective and the processes of human rights in Iran. And as you were talking, I had so many questions. So hopefully I can ask them now on behalf of our group. Just something small to start. When you were mentioning the TV confessions of Dr. Djalali, if the public in general doesn't believe that these confessions are legitimate, why does the Iranian government choose to publish them?
That's a very good question, actually. I mean, we have asked the same question. So I think there is always, on one hand, there are always some people who believe in it. I mean, they are not the majority, but the Iranian authorities, they have their supporters, which are not the majority. Let's say, in the best case, 20%. So that's for the internal use, but the other part is to justify their action. So, they say that we have arrested. I mean, if you ask an Iranian diplomat, why didn't you release Dr. Djalali? he would say, but he's a spy. He has confessed to that, and he will probably show that video to you, where he basically doesn't say anything. So it's you know, they pretend, you know, they know that we all know, but again, as long as they don't say it directly that this is a hostage, they open the way for the West to pay without breaking their own principles. Because, you know, you have probably heard that Western countries always say that we don't negotiate with hostage takers, but they negotiate with Iran to release Nazanin Zaghari because, you know, the Iranian authorities has given it another form. So it is very useful. And sometimes, sorry, in other cases, they want to prepare, let's say, when they want to sentence someone, or when even they want to carry out the sentence. That's a kind of you know, propaganda that, you know, they make a confession showing that, okay, you know, there are many examples that, you know, they wanted, you know, to act, you know, they come with very big lies that, you know, he gave big secrets to the Israel, and the Israelis came and assassinated our scientists, and you know, this person was the one who gave the information, and you know, they prepared the opinion for what they are going to do.
So it sounds like it's more for an external context, more for the West rather than the people within Iran.
Yeah, I mean, their own group of supporters, and for the West, you know, to give it a more, you know, an easier case to deal with. Like, yeah.
You mentioned Nazanin Radcliffe, who was freed for, I think you said, 400 million pounds, and that hostage diplomacy has escalated, which means that Iran is taking more dual nationals. But within that is a dilemma where we don't want to encourage the taking of hostages, and we don't want to enable their actions by requesting or giving money to have them released. But we also, our work focuses on Dr. Djalali's freedom. So how can we, as a group, confront this dilemma, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it is a dilemma, as you say, because I mean, as let's say, as Mahmoud, who has met, you know, the family of Dr. Djalali, and I want him to come back at any price. But then, as you say, you know, we have a responsibility. When I say we, not only as individuals, but also, you know, what we call the free world. You know, we have some principles, and we know that, you know, we have seen that, you know, when Western countries really want something, they know how to act. I think that taking hostages the way they did with Dr. Djalali and others, it must be unacceptable. Iranian authorities, they arrested Dr. Djalali in 2016, but I can't, I don't think I know of any strong actions. Of course, let's say the strongest action was that some of these countries gave Dr. Djalali their own citizenship, which was good. But we need stronger action. How would we react if the authorities actually said what they did? Like, they actually took a hostage and took it to Tehran. Let's say if Iran takes a Canadian citizen officially as a hostage and take it to Iran and say, give me money or we will not release him, then I think Canada, and the same with the European countries, they would react differently. So Iran pretends that there is a case, but so do we. So I think that we as a group, as human rights defenders or as a civil society, we don't need to pretend that it's something else than it is. I mean, I'm not going to oppose if the Swedish government pays Iranian authorities to get Dr. Djalali released, but I'm going to call it a hostage taking and ransom. So I think that's what, bringing up the truth and making the case strong, because I strongly believe that if release of Dr. Djalali was on top of the agenda for, let's say, European countries, since he has been citizen there, then they would have been acting differently. And that's our job, to make the case so big that they actually do act differently.
Great, thank you. Our next question revolves around the advocacy that has already been done. I know a lot of previous advocacy efforts, even the ones that your organization, Iran Human Rights, has been involved in, including writing letters to like the European Parliament, as well as the international attention given the UN Special Rapporteur. Have any of these advocacy efforts been able to increase the political costs for freeing Dr. Djalali?
They have certainly increased the political cost for the Iranian authorities, certainly. Just an example, just in order to remove the attention from the human rights situation in Iran, because that's what the UN Special Rapporteur does. By presenting 2 reports every year, they put the human rights situation on the UN agenda, right? And Iranian authorities, they work so hard to change the votes of as many countries as possible. We know of actually, they travel to, if I'm not mistaken, several countries actually, especially in Africa, where they, they both promise financial aid and, things of that kind, so that they don't vote for the special rapporteur. So unlike what they claim, it's very important for them not to get negative publicity. So, for example, the fact that Sweden, just an example, gave Dr. Djalali honorary citizenship after he was arrested, I don't think it would have happened if Dr. Djalali's case wasn't been known, to the public. It became a high-profile case. There was pressure on the Swedish government, and they did it. And when they give citizenship to someone, because our concern was that since Dr. Djalali, although he had been in both Sweden, Belgium, Italy for many years working there, but he hadn't received the citizenship yet. He had the permanent residence. Our concern was that these countries would not pay so much attention to Dr. Jalali because of that. But now that they have given the citizenship, then they are obliged, they have another level of obligations. So I think that they raise the cost, and so our aim is to raise the cost so much that keeping him is more harmful for the authorities than releasing. And I think that can happen. And that happens by engaging our own authorities in that. So I think that, let's say, I mean, Iranian authorities, they have visited several European countries. European leaders have been visiting Iran. I don't know about Canada, but in Canada, some years ago, the diplomatic relations, they were not so good, but they have been rebuilt, right? So I think that if every time they meet each other, one of the first things our governments ask them is about Dr. Jalali and similar cases, I think that will make a difference. So it's about putting it higher up on the agenda. That raises the political cost for Iran, because it should be a scandal if any of the countries that we believe respect human rights, if they make any kind of deal with Iran without getting back something on the human rights side, and releasing of Dr. Jalali and many other prisoners of conscience could be that kind of demand. And I mean, I think several. Did you hear Nazanin Ratcliffe's press conference? He said that as long as there are so many others in prison, I don't feel free. Although, and that's how they think, because they have been in those prisons, they have seen people around them who are in prison, and just for expressing their opinion, or even less than that, and nobody knows about them. So I think we should have a long-term goal, but I think what you are doing is very good. All long-term goals go through specific cases, and that's how I started too. When I was I just finished my PhD, that like many years ago. I read about a girl who was sentenced to death for immoral acts, and her name was Layla. And when I read her story, it was like heartbreaking. It was, from age of 8, her parents, who were very poor, and I think there was some drug addiction in the family, and so they used to sell Layla as a prostitute. And in Iran, it is allowed to get engaged, like religious marriages that can last from very short time. It's just basically legal prostitution. So they had been using her this way, and so she got pregnant twice. Each time, I think first time was like when she was 12, and each time the authorities took, once they were twins, They took children from her, and she was sentenced to 100 lashes for immoral acts. And eventually they had given her to an older man who had started a brothel with Layla. And once the police comes and they arrest everyone, and they point at Layla as the one who is responsible for this brothel. At that time, she was 16. And then the judge sentenced her to death. And you can read more about Layla, because she had a mental age of 8. People who had talked to her, she talks like a child. Like, they ask, what do you want? Well, they ask her, do you miss your mommy? Yeah, I miss her a lot, but she never comes to visit me here. And then they ask her, what do you want? If I meet your mom, what shall I say? She would say, ask her to bring my red skirt and some what do you call it? These cheese puffs, like things that children like. So her mental age was like an 8-year-old, and they wanted to execute her. So at that time, I had been, for my PhD, I was I got a gold medal, so I had to go and visit the king, Norwegian king. So I had been once on the TV. So then I thought to use these connections to get, at least to make people in Norway to know about Layla. And then I also talked to a journalist, and they decided to write a story about Layla every single day. One of Norway's biggest newspapers. And in 1 week, Layla's case was so big that everybody was talking about it. And I remember that one December day, very cold here in Norway, it's like in Canada. At 8 a.m., there were like hundreds of Norwegians standing outside the Iranian embassy, calling for Layla to be released. And Norwegian Prime Minister wrote a personal letter to the Iranian president. And then they had to change, they had to commute the death sentence. And a few months later, they had to release Layla. Of course, they couldn't release her completely, so they lashed her 99 times. But then they had to release her. And I think, by starting with one case, you create so much awareness that it can help others as well. It was a very short version of Layla's story. It's very long. You should read about her.
That was an amazing, moving story. I think we'll all definitely be looking into that after this, for sure. Just one last question on the things that you were just talking about. We obviously, our story and what we are starting with is Dr. Djalali, and we're looking to raise awareness for him in any way we can, but we've been finding it's a little bit challenging to get both individuals as well as the Canadian government to really care about Dr. Djalali's case. What would your advice on incentivizing people to care and spread the word?
Now that's you see, as I said, I mean, the governments and politicians, they are very, they think very much in terms of what you call it, realpolitik, like, nothing, they say, okay, let's not get too emotional, and we are at that level, right? But we are not. I mean, we are talking about human beings. I mean, it's not a case, it's a human being. He could be my brother, it could be a father of any of the students around. Just imagine traveling to a country, and then out of the blue, they arrest your father, and they say that he has done this or that, and they threat with death sentence. And on the other hand, of course, we expect, I mean, we elect these politicians, we expect them to be our voices. So I think it's very important not to talk like a politician. But I mean, why do we care? It's because, we care about another human being, because we have empathy. We want a better world. We don't want a world where people's lives don't matter at all. Only so-called big questions matter, because we see now, what's happening in this war. Actually, if individual lives had mattered, people would have reacted to Putin or any other dictator or authoritarian regime a long time ago. And I think it's it's a very strong message. Just why do you care? Because what you if you say it the way it is from your heart, it will go to, I'm not sure immediately to the politicians, but because what you need to do is bringing this message to as many as possible. And that's, using the media, the way we did with Leila. I mean, who would think that, people in Norway, like 6,000 kilometers away from Iran, in a ice cold December day before going to work, they would actually find the way to the Iranian embassy and standing there. It's because they were moved by this story. And the reason was that I didn't keep the story for myself. And it took me a long time. It was like 1 week I was calling, because I had tried to find, okay, which journalists write about Iran, identify them, and written emails, nobody responded. I called them, they say, okay, you have to wait, and let's see. And I remember at the university, there was a Christmas party. So I was at the party, but and then my phone rang, and then I answered. It was this journalist, and he said, this was the last journalist I had talked to. So I was almost about to give up. But I basically talked to all the journalists who had been working on Iran. And one of them said yes. And then that was enough, that's why Leila is alive now. And I think it's, you should not give up, because what you're doing is extremely important. I mean, this is what makes, just not to use big words, but, the difference between a democratic country and a dictator is that in a democratic country, actually, every single individual has a power, has the possibility to make a change. But of course, we need to become more people. And what the challenge that you said, it's very frustrating. I mean, of course, everybody has his or her own issues in life. So what you want to do is to make the destiny of a man none of us have met personally, to an important issue in everyone else's lives. And we can do that because, you know, we have the ability to do that, and all human beings can actually link, they can get this feeling if you make it, if they put themselves in the family's place. So I would say that you need to use, of course, we have to be just creative. Sometimes, just words that come out of your heart makes the difference. Sometimes, for example, talk to his wife, and you are not looking for political statements, because there are so many people who give the political statement, but just make this human being known, make people relate to him. And I think if many people care, the governments will have to do something.
I think that was a great ending to our talk here. I think that's a great also call to action for all of us, making it known Dr. Djalali's story, making other people care, putting his story into our lives and putting ourselves in their shoes of the family is something that we're definitely going to be carrying through our advocacy here. And thank you, Dr. Mahmoud Amiry-Moghaddam, for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you are doing what you are doing. It's very important.